Civil disobedience is the active, professed refusal to obey certain laws, demands, and commands of a government, or of an occupying international power. Civil disobedience is a symbolic or ritualistic violation of the law, rather than a rejection of the system as a whole. Civil disobedience is sometimes, though not always, defined as being nonviolent resistance. Overview. One of its earliest massive implementations was brought about by Egyptians against the British occupation in the 1919 revolution. Civil disobedience is one of the many ways people have rebelled against what they deem to be unfair laws. It has been used in many non-violent resistance movements in India, in Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution, and in East Germany to oust their communist governments, in South Africa in the fight against apartheid, in the American Civil Rights Movement, in the Singing Revolution to bring independence to the Baltic countries from the Soviet Union, recently with the 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia and the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine, among other various movements worldwide. One of the oldest depictions of civil disobedience is in Sophocles' play Antigone, in which Antigone, one of the daughters of former king of Thebes, Oedipus, defies Creon, the current king of Thebes, who is trying to stop her from giving her brother Polynices a proper burial. She gives a stirring speech in which she tells him that she must obey her conscience rather than human law. She is not at all afraid of the death he threatens her with, but she is afraid of how her conscience will smite her if she does not do this. Following the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, poet Percy Shelley wrote the political poem The Mask of Anarchy later that year. That begins with the images of what he thought to be the unjust forms of authority of his time, and then imagines the stirrings of a new form of social action. It is perhaps the first modern statement of the principle of nonviolent protest. A version was taken up by the author Henry David Thoreau in his essay Civil Disobedience, and later by Gandhi in his doctrine of Satyagraha. Gandhi's Satyagraha was partially influenced and inspired by Shelley's nonviolence in protest and political action. In particular, it is known that Gandhi would often quote Shelley's Mask of Anarchy to vast audiences during the campaign for a free India. Thoreau's 1848 essay Civil Disobedience, originally titled Resistance to Civil Government, has had a wide influence on many later practitioners of civil disobedience. The driving idea behind the essay is that citizens are morally responsible for their support of aggressors, even when such support is required by law. In the essay, Thoreau explained his reasons for having refused to pay taxes as an act of protest against slavery and against the Mexican-American War. He writes, "If I devote myself to other pursuits and contemplations, I must first see, at least, that I do not pursue them sitting upon another man's shoulders. I must get off him first, that he may pursue his contemplations too. See what gross inconsistency is tolerated. I have heard some of my townsmen say, I should like to have them order me out to help put down an insurrection of the slaves, or to march to Mexico, see if I would go, and yet these very men have each, directly by their allegiance, and so indirectly, at least, by their money, furnished a substitute." By the 1850s, a range of minority groups in the United States, blacks, Jews, Seventh-day Baptists, Catholics, anti-prohibitionists, racial egalitarians, and others, employed civil disobedience to combat a range of legal measures and public practices that to them promoted ethnic, religious, and racial discrimination. Public and typically peaceful resistance to public power would remain an integral tactic in modern American minority rights politics. Etymology. Thoreau's 1849 essay, Resistance to Civil Government, was eventually renamed Essay on Civil Disobedience, after his landmark lectures were published in 1866. The term began to appear in numerous sermons and lectures relating to slavery and the war in Mexico. Thus, by the time Thoreau's lectures were first published under the title, Civil Disobedience, in 1866, 4 years after his death, The term had achieved fairly widespread usage. It has been argued that the term civil disobedience has always suffered from ambiguity and in modern times become utterly debased. Marshall Cohen notes, it has been used to describe everything from bringing a test case in the federal courts to taking aim at a federal official. Indeed, for Vice President Agnew it has become a code word describing the activities of muggers, arsonists, draft evaders, campaign hecklers, campus militants, anti-war demonstrators, juvenile delinquents and political assassins. Legranda writes that the formulation of a single all-encompassing definition of the term is extremely difficult, if not impossible. In reviewing the voluminous literature on the subject, the student of civil disobedience rapidly finds himself surrounded by a maze of semantical problems and grammatical niceties. Like Alice in Wonderland, he often finds that specific terminology has no more meaning than the individual orator intends it to have. He encourages a distinction between lawful protest demonstration, nonviolent civil disobedience, and violent civil disobedience. In a letter to P.K. Rao, dated September 10, 1935, Gandhi disputes that his idea of civil disobedience was derived from the writings of Thoreau. The statement that I had derived my idea of civil disobedience from the writings of Thoreau is wrong. The resistance to authority in South Africa was well advanced before I got the essay. When I saw the title of Thoreau's great essay, I began to use his phrase to explain our struggle to the English readers. But I found that even civil disobedience failed to convey the full meaning of the struggle. I therefore adopted the phrase civil resistance theories. In seeking an active form of civil disobedience, one may choose to deliberately break certain laws, such as by forming a peaceful blockade or occupying a facility illegally. Though sometimes violence has been known to occur, often there is an expectation to be attacked or even beaten by the authorities. Protesters often undergo training in advance on how to react to arrest or to attack. Civil disobedience is usually defined as pertaining to a citizen's relation to the state and its laws, as distinguished from a constitutional impasse in which two public agencies, especially two equally sovereign branches of government, conflict. For instance, if the head of government of a country were to refuse to enforce a decision of that country's highest court, it would not be civil disobedience, since the head of government would be acting in her or his capacity as public official rather than private citizen. However, this definition is disrupted by Thoreau's political philosophy pitching the conscience versus the collective. The individual is the final judge of right and wrong. More than this, since only individuals act, only individuals can act unjustly. When the government knocks on the door, it is an individual in the form of a postman or tax collector whose hand hits the wood. Before Thoreau's imprisonment, when a confused taxman had wondered aloud about how to handle his refusal to pay, Thoreau had advised, resign. If a man chose to be an agent of injustice, then Thoreau insisted on confronting him with the fact that he was making a choice. But if government is the voice of the people, as it is often called, shouldn't that voice be heeded? Thoreau admits that government may express the will of the majority, but it may also express nothing more than the will of elite politicians. Even a good form of government is liable to be abused and perverted before the people can act through it. Moreover, even if a government did express the voice of the people, this fact would not compel the obedience of individuals who disagree with what is being said. The majority may be powerful, but it is not necessarily right. What, then, is the proper relationship between the individual and the government? Ronald Dworkin held that there are three types of civil disobedience. Integrity-based civil disobedience occurs when a citizen disobeys a law she or he feels is immoral, as in the case of Northerners disobeying the fugitive slave laws by refusing to turn over escaped slaves to authorities. Justice-based civil disobedience occurs when a citizen disobeys laws in order to lay claim to some right denied to her or him, as when blacks illegally protested during the civil rights movement. Policy-based civil disobedience occurs when a person breaks the law in order to change a policy he believes is dangerously wrong. Some theories of civil disobedience hold that civil disobedience is only justified against governmental entities. Brownlee argues that disobedience in opposition to the decisions of non-governmental agencies such as trade unions, banks, and private universities can be justified if it reflects a larger challenge to the legal system that permits those decisions to be taken. The same principle, she argues, applies to breaches of law in protest against international organizations and foreign governments. But Stephen Ellman argues that if it is necessary to disobey rules that conflict with morality, we might ask why disobedience should take the form of public civil disobedience rather than simply covert law-breaking. If a lawyer wishes to help a client overcome legal obstacles to securing her or his natural rights, he might, for instance, find that assisting in fabricating evidence or committing perjury is more effective than open disobedience. This assumes that common morality does not have a prohibition on deceit in such situations. The Fully Informed Jury Association's publication, A Primer for Prospective Jurors, notes, "Think of the dilemma faced by German citizens when Hitler's secret police demanded to know if they were hiding a Jew in their house. By this definition, civil disobedience could be traced back to the Book of Exodus, where Shiphrah and Puah refused a direct order of Pharaoh but misrepresented how they did it." Violent versus nonviolent. There have been debates as to whether civil disobedience must necessarily be nonviolent. Black's Law Dictionary includes nonviolence in its definition of civil disobedience. Christian Bay's Encyclopedia article states that civil disobedience requires carefully chosen and legitimate means, but holds that they do not have to be non-violent. It has been argued that, while both civil disobedience and civil rebellion are justified by appeal to constitutional defects, rebellion is much more destructive. Therefore, the defects justifying rebellion must be much more serious than those justifying disobedience. And if one cannot justify civil rebellion, then one cannot justify a civil disobedience, use of force and violence, and refusal to submit to arrest. Civil disobedience, refraining from violence, is also said to help preserve society's tolerance of civil disobedience. Philosopher H.J. McCloskey argues that, if violent, intimidatory, coercive disobedience is more effective, it is, other things being equal, more justified than less effective, nonviolent disobedience. In his best-selling Disobedience and Democracy, 9 Fallacies on Law and Order, Howard Zinn takes a similar position. Zinn states that while the goals of civil disobedience are generally nonviolent, in the inevitable tension accompanying the transition from a violent world to a non-violent one, the choice of means will almost never be pure, and will involve such complexities that the simple distinction between violence and non-violence does not suffice as a guide. The very acts with which we seek to do good cannot escape the imperfections of the world we are trying to change. Zinn rejects any easy and righteous dismissal of violence, noting that Henry Thoreau, the popularizer of the term civil disobedience, approved of the armed insurrection of John Brown. He also notes that some major civil disobedience campaigns which have been classified as nonviolent, such as the Birmingham campaign, have actually included elements of violence. Revolutionary versus non-revolutionary. Non-revolutionary civil disobedience is a simple disobedience of laws on the grounds that they are judged wrong by an individual conscience, or as part of an effort to render certain laws ineffective, to cause their repeal, or to exert pressure to get one's political wishes on some other issue. Revolutionary civil disobedience is more of an active attempt to overthrow a government. Gandhi's acts have been described as revolutionary civil disobedience. It has been claimed that the Hungarians under Ferenc Sték directed revolutionary civil disobedience against the Austrian government. Thoreau also wrote of civil disobedience accomplishing peaceable revolution. Howard Zinn, Harvey Wheeler, and others have identified the right espoused in the Declaration of Independence to alter or abolish an unjust government to be a principle of civil disobedience. Collective versus solitary. The earliest recorded incidents of collective civil disobedience took place during the Roman Empire. Unarmed Jews gathered in the streets to prevent the installation of pagan images in the temple in Jerusalem. In modern times, some activists who commit civil disobedience as a group collectively refuse to sign bail until certain demands are met, such as favorable bail conditions, or the release of all the activists. This is a form of jail solidarity. There have also been many instances of solitary civil disobedience, such as that committed by Thoreau, but these sometimes go unnoticed. Thoreau, at the time of his arrest, was not yet a well-known author, and his arrest was not covered in any newspapers in the days, weeks and months after it happened. The tax collector who arrested him rose to higher political office, and Thoreau's essay was not published until after the end of the Mexican War.